All right, Psalm 81 tonight. We'll be looking at Psalm 81. We're going to read through it first, and then we will kind of take it in piece by piece and look at it together here. Sing aloud to God, our strength. Make a joyful shout to the God of Jacob. Raise a song and strike the timbrel, the pleasant harp with the lute. Blow the trumpet at the time of the new moon, at the full moon, on our solemn feast day. For this is a statute for Israel, a law of the God of Jacob. This he established in Joseph as a testimony, when he went throughout the land of Egypt, where I heard a language I did not understand. I removed his shoulder from the burden. His hands were freed from the baskets. You called in trouble, and I delivered you. I answered you in the secret place of thunder. I tested you at the waters of Meribah. Hear, O my people, and I will admonish you. O Israel, if you will listen to me, there shall be no foreign god among you, nor shall you worship any foreign god. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Open your mouth wide, and I will fill it. But my people would not heed my voice, and Israel would have none of me. So I gave them over to their own stubborn hearts to walk in their own counsels. Oh, that my people would listen to me, that Israel would walk in my ways. I would soon subdue their enemies and turn my hand against their adversaries. The haters of the Lord would pretend submission to him, but their fate would endure forever. He would have fed them also with the finest of wheat, and with honey from the rock I would have satisfied you. Psalm 81 is another psalm of Asaph, and as we've been in this book of the Psalms, we've seen several from Asaph. And I think what I appreciate about these psalms as Ronald has gone through them is you can see these are not happy time psalms. It's funny when you think about American culture. I haven't been around for too long in the culture, but looking back now, especially with the internet, you can look at culture from whatever year you want to. I would say if we looked at culture from let's start with 100 years ago. Was there a certain innocence to the culture back then? Listen to what songs people sang about. I mean, things weren't to a certain, there's always been sin in our culture and in every culture, but at least public-facing, what people sung about, what they made movies about, this different stuff, it was a pretty innocent culture in that way, and songs were happy, and people were happy, and there was a lot to be happy about. Now, obviously, as things moved through history, there were times that weren't happy. We can think of times like the Great Depression, the war years, really dark times, but at the same time, I think there was an understanding in the past of times where things were just a little bit more innocent. People were happy. They had something to look forward to in their life, maybe. And as you look throughout the book of Psalms, I think you see that as well. During the Davidic years, and even the years of Solomon, Israel had a lot to be happy about, right? The songs, they reflect that they felt like they were on top of the world. It felt like all the promises that God had made to Abraham were coming true in the kingdom of David and Solomon. They had not only the land of Canaan, but God enlarged their borders out to where they held a large, portion of the world in the palm of their hand. And not only that, it wasn't just that they owned a lot of land, but Israel really was the center of world politics at the time, it seems, at least under Solomon. With all the riches of Solomon, who all went to Solomon to see kind of the splendor and listen to his wisdom? Who? Seemed like everybody, right? The Queen of Sheba came, the nations came, they brought him gifts just so they could kind of come and see just the opulence of this kingdom that Solomon had. And so during this time, the Psalms were very much, as again, we can think of times in our culture where things were all good, very happy, very positive. God's blessed us, times are good, we're happy. But as we move into the Psalms of Asaph, which we've been in for the last little bit, you can see the quality of life has shifted drastically. We're in these years now where the temple, which again was this foundational mainstay of their worship, of their society, well, it's been looted. And some of the people have been taken away into captivity. And all those promises that they thought were money in the bank, that they were fulfilled and that all was well, now they're losing some of those things. And so in a lot of Asaph's psalms, they're very human in that we see him asking questions of God, why would you let this happen? God, where are you? God, what are you going to do? Kind of not pointing the finger at God, but in asking God the question, what are you going to do to fix this? Where are you at? When can we expect you to intervene and put our enemies to shame and glorify your own name and your works? But Psalm 81, to me, it's kind of an answer in a lot of ways. It's God's answer to the base cause of the people's problem. Whenever we have problems in life in general, our first inclination is never to look in the mirror and say, well, I must be the cause of my own problems. What do we always do first? Blame everybody else, right? And it'll either be somebody that's a warm body in front of us, right? Well, that person that I work with, they're the cause of all my problems because they did this to me today and that made me mad. Or this person's the cause of my problems. Or this family member, well, I was set up to fail from the beginning because my family never put me in the right position to succeed. We always want to blame somebody, but when there's nobody human to blame, then we start pointing the finger where? Up, right? Well, it must be God that did this. It must be God that's following through on his promises. And I think we have to be careful, even as we read the last few Psalms of Asaph. I don't think the Psalms ever cross that line into being sacrilegious, because we know Israel would have sung these songs in their worship. So it was never across that line where it goes, well, this is just blasphemous against God to question this way. But there's still songs that made them think, okay, where is God? What is he doing? Why isn't he intervening? And at various points in our life, again, we all reach some kind of valley where we ask that question in some form. If you haven't, you're lucky. But I have at least once or twice in my I keep saying relatively short life. I turned 30. It's getting harder and harder to pull that off. It feels short, though, right? I've had a couple of those moments where I say, God, where are you at? Why did you let this happen? Something that maybe I was praying for months or a year. God, just no matter what, I can live in a cardboard box. Just don't let this happen. Then what happens? The one thing I asked not to happen. Why? Why would you let this happen? Why, with all of your power and your sovereignty, why won't you intervene in this? But here again, in Psalm 81, we flip the picture and we see it from God's perspective. Now, we can never fully inhabit God's perspective because we lack God's, everything, right? God is perfect. He's infinite in all of his capacities. And so, as we'll see in this psalm, there are emotions that God has. And I'm always afraid to say, well, God has this emotion and it's kind of like this emotion we have. No, our emotion is kind of like God's feeling. But what's different is God experiences those emotions with perfect sinlessness. And so when we do almost anything, when we get angry, can God get angry? Absolutely, he can get angry. The Bible says that he can get angry. Does God ever get angry in a sinful way? It's impossible. He has perfect, sinless anger. So we can't fully understand that, but we can understand a part of God's feeling in his heart in the way that we have emotions that can correspond with it, even though our emotions are imperfect. But let's kind of walk through this, and I just kind of threw some verses in really quick on the computer. I'm going to have Jonathan go through. I may not even remember what I put in, but we'll look at the verses in the psalm, and then we'll tie that in to other places in the Bible that are pertinent references maybe. So let's start with the first 4 verses here. Sing aloud to God our strength. Make a joyful shout to the God of Jacob. Raise a song and strike the timbrel, a pleasant harp with the lute. Blow the trumpet at the time of the new moon, at the full moon, on our solemn feast day. For this is a statute for Israel, a law of the God of Jacob. So when we read this, it's a thing that happens several times with the Old Testament we're reading, where depending on our level of knowledge about the Old Testament or our comfort with it, things can sound very alien to us. For one thing, I should say, we see immediately the use of instruments in this passage, and for us, a lot of times, because we're so distinctive in not using instruments in our worship today, when we see them in psalms like this, we can get a little bit touchy and go, oh, what's going on here? Why do we have instruments in this passage? Well, that's not the point of this passage, and the point of the readers reading it would have immediately seen this passage and viewed it in a worship-type setting under the law of Moses. A couple of things come to mind. Of course, we know in the temple there was authorized worship with instruments. God commanded certain instruments and gave David the plans for them. And so as we see this instrument kind of motif here, we see it in the context of verse 1. Sing aloud to God. They're worshiping God. They're giving God his due. The other thing that comes to mind for me when it talks about the timbrel and these things is a very kind of a picture of worshiping God for his deliverance. You remember when they came out of Egypt and they crossed over the Red Sea. When they came to the other side, what did they do? They worshiped God in song, right? It mentions they took out the timbrel. They took out, the women had this stuff, and they worshiped God and praised him for the deliverance that he had given to them. And so in the first place, we start this psalm with an idea of worship. We start it with this idea of maybe even worshiping God for the deliverance that he's given. Starting in verse 3, though, again, some things that sound very strange to us. Blow the trumpet at the time of the new moon, at the full moon on our solemn feast day, for this is a statute for Israel, a law of the God of Jacob. Now, I'll be honest with you. I look up at the moon in the sky, and if it's full, I know what that is, and otherwise, I don't have a lot of knowledge about moon cycles. I've never been much of an almanac reader. But what he's talking about here are certain times of the month. And I think what they would correspond to, we could find in the book of Leviticus. I think I put those verses in there. Leviticus 23. God says, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, in the seventh month, on the first day of the month, you shall have a Sabbath rest, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it, and you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord." We are pretty familiar with the idea of the Sabbath day, right? The one that was commanded in the Ten Commandments there at Mount Sinai. This day of rest where the people were supposed to focus on God and not on the normal work that they would do. Was the Sabbath day an excuse to be lazy? Is that why God gave them the Sabbath day? No. They had to do what on the day before the Sabbath? Work twice as hard, right? They had to work and gather enough for that day. But in doing so, they had this Sabbath rest. Well, depending on the time of month or during the time during their year, they had what you would almost call extra Sabbaths. They had these feast days that would come. And so you have here described the feast, if you would, of trumpets. This day at the first day of the month, which would correspond, I believe, I'm trying to think what he said, if that would be the new moon. In the Psalm 81, where he talked about blowing the trumpets at the time of the new moon. And that day would be a holy convocation to God. They wouldn't do any work, and they would offer sacrifices on that day. Going forward after that in the seventh month, let's go to the next verse there, Jonathan. You would see sandwiched here, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Also the 10th day of this seventh month shall be the day of atonement. It shall be a holy convocation for you. You shall afflict your souls and offer an offering made by fire to the Lord." So on the first day, you had the Feast of Trumpets. On the 10th day, you had the Day of Atonement, which we could go into great detail on. It was a very important day. It was the one day of the year that the high priest went into the most holy place to offer sacrifices for his sin first, and then for the sins of the entirety of Israel. Kind of the again, focal point of the year is this one day where sin in kind of an ultimate sense is taken care of. And so you have that on the 10th, and then moving forward farther into Leviticus 23, it said, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, The 15th day of this seventh month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days to the Lord. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it." So from what I understand, this 15th day would correspond to the full moon. And so you would have the new moon, and then halfway through you would have the full moon. And so at least in this seventh month, that trumpet blowing, these certain things, this cycle would have put the people's mind on worship of God and the law of God as it came to these days. Really quickly, what was the point of all of these feast days? What was the point of them? To remember God, right? You're exactly right. All of them were just like the memorials, like the stones they took out of the Jordan River and they stacked up so they could look and they could tell their children, this is what God did, this is what this stands for. All of the feast days were pointers and reminders for what God had done for his people. We don't have these yearly kind of bookmarks in the New Testament, right? We don't have throughout our year feast days. Now, obviously, some do. The Catholic Church or the Anglican Church, they would have feast days in honor of various saints of different time periods and such. We don't. But at the same time, are we left without reminders? No. What do we have? We have the Lord's Supper, right? We live still in this rhythm of being reminded of who God is. Now, Israel, every year, they would have experienced this rhythm, but now looking back, we understand that really all of these things were pointing to who? Jesus, right? And so even what we have on the screen right now, the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Booths, or even better, the Feast of Tents, there would always be a time, even when Israel had brick and mortar houses on the mountain of Jerusalem, even at that point, there was a time of the year where God said, you need to go out into the wild outside the city and stay in what? Tents. Why did God want them to stay in tents? What did they need to remember? The 40 years of wandering. They need to remember the time where they lived in tents, right? Remember that you didn't always have this mountain that God gave you. At one point, you were wanderers, you were nomads that had to move around before God gave you a place, and that was to remind them of where God had brought them, right? It was to put them into that mentality of remembering where they had come from and where they were going, right? And so again, we shouldn't allow that rhythm we live in of living through the week, coming to Sunday, meeting around this table. That's supposed to have an effect on us too, right? That's supposed to remind us of who we are and where we've come from and where we're going to. It's the same type of thing. It's just different because in Jesus, all of those other feast days and pointers have been brought to fruition. Again, we would go to the Gospel of John and read language on the lines of the Word was made flesh and He tabernacled among us, right? He lived among us. Jesus put on a sort of tent, right? He wandered here when He didn't have to, right? He became a man and came to this earth and went through that for our sakes. And so all these things we could tie back into the person of Jesus and what He accomplished. But either way, I say all this to say a long way around, this psalm would have put people in a worship mindset. It would have inserted them into this yearly rhythm. That's where their mind's going to be, the law of God, worshiping Him, what He's done for them in the past. And let's see where it leads forward. Let's go to the next one, Jonathan. Starting in verse 5. This He established in Joseph as a testimony when he went throughout the land of Egypt, where I heard a language I did not understand. I removed his shoulder from the burden. His hands were freed from the baskets. You called in trouble, and I delivered you. I answered you in the secret place of thunder. I tested you at the waters of Meribah. And so when he says in verse 5, this He established in Joseph as a testimony, he's talking about what came before, right? Those feast days, the worship of God that they would have had. Those things were a testimony to God, to who He was and to what He had done. Now here he says in Joseph, which is interesting because in my mind, you obviously hear a lot Israel and Judah. At times you'll hear Ephraim as a stand-in for all of Israel. But Joseph, to me, is a little more rare to be a stand-in for, in my mind, the entirety of Israel. But again, we can't divorce the narrative of Israel's salvation from Joseph, right? Joseph was the person there that God placed through trials, through suffering, in the place so that he could be the one not only to save the Israelites, the people of Israel that came to Egypt, but also all of the Egyptians and the other nations that came to Egypt. Joseph was really the savior of all of those people through the famine. But he says, I've established this in Joseph as a testimony when he, and this would be God, went throughout the land of Egypt. And it says, where I heard a language I did not understand. And I'll be honest with you, I don't have a perfect answer for what that's referring to. So some things immediately come to mind that there was a time, of course, when Israel in the land of Egypt, after their years of slavery, had almost, I don't want to say they'd forgotten who Yahweh was, who Jehovah was, but we know they had forgotten a lot of the statutes and the words that He had said to Abraham and to Jacob and to the ones that had come before that had known how to worship God. They had understood who God was and how He was to be approached. The people that lived in Egypt brought idolatry with them out of Egypt. The Israelites became idolaters while they were in Egypt. They had picked up on some of the practices of the Egyptians. And so that was where they were when God came and took them out of that situation. And that's what God says here. He says, I removed his shoulder from the burden. His hands were freed from the baskets. You called in trouble and I delivered you. And so again, God is saying, this is where you were. You were in Egypt. You were slaves. You were working under the Egyptians. And I removed those things from you. It wasn't of your own power. It wasn't of your own really worthiness of me doing that. But I did it for you. You called and I delivered you. I answered you in the secret place of thunder. I tested you at the waters of Meribah. Another reference to a time during this Exodus period where God tested the people, right? And it's amazing how many times God used water as a test. Right? Drink of this water in this place. Oh, it's bitter. We'll throw this in and then it'll be made sweet and you can drink it. Well, strike this rock or speak to this rock and water will come out of it. Of course, in addition to the use of water in the plagues and the parting of the Red Sea as well. But again, we see here God saying, this is what I've done. This is what I've brought you out of. Let's go to the next verse here, Jonathan. We see here, again, this calling of Moses in Exodus chapter 3. I think that's kind of the reference to God appearing to Moses and saying, you need to go to this people that doesn't even really know me and tell them my intentions. It says in Exodus 3:15, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, the Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial to all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, appeared to me, saying, I have surely visited you and seen what is done to you in Egypt. And I have said, I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and the Jebusites, to a land flowing with milk and honey. And so God has this miraculous appearance to Moses. He's going to come and save the people of Israel from their oppression. Let's keep going, Jonathan. So God he said, through this worship setting first, in the context of that testimony, to just the straight up testimony of, this is where you were. I brought you out of Egypt. I did this through Joseph, and I came and I released you from slavery, and I heard your cry for need of help, and I came and helped you. So note what he says in verse 8 here. Hear, O my people, and I will admonish you. Never good when God says that, right? Listen up. Listen up, I need to admonish you. I need to correct you. I need to put you in your place. O Israel, if you will listen to me. Again, God is not a being that's bound by emotion like we are at times, to where emotion overrides our intellect or overrides our clear thinking. But God in his perfect wisdom can still make statements like this of, again, almost the cry of someone just pleading for people to listen. O Israel, if you will listen to me, there shall be no foreign god among you, nor shall you worship any foreign god. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Open your mouth wide, and I will fill it. Now, a couple things there. In a minute, we'll go on to some verses that deal with specifically with idolatry. But I want to focus for a moment on that last line there. Open your mouth wide, and I will fill it. God, his statement, his promise has always been this. If you will follow me with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, I will take care of you. You will have whatever you need. I will make sure that you have food on the table. I will make sure you have clothing to wear. Is that any different than the teaching of Jesus in the New Testament? No, it's the exact same teaching, right? God is pleading again, saying, I want your heart. I want you to, again, truly give yourself over to worship of me. I want to be your God, and if you do that, I will take care of you. Now, moving on, let's go to the next verse, Jonathan. We see Israel at Mount Sinai, and I think sometimes because we're so separated from idolatry in the traditional sense of bowing down to an image of some kind. I have never been to India, and I know there they do have traditional idolatry, and in many places in the world they do have traditional idolatry. But I think sometimes it's too foreign to us, and we need to work kind of doubly hard to keep in mind just how big a deal this was. It says, when God spoke all these words in the hearing of all the people of Israel, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. Now, recently I did a class over in the other building on the First Commandments, and I made the case at least that I believe we think of commandment just as the rule part, right? Commandments, here's what you got to do. But I believe God's statement that I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt is just as much of a part of that first commandment as anything else. He's saying, here's who I am. Here's who you are in relation to me. I'm the God that bought you from the slavery of the Egyptians. I paid for you. You are mine now, and because of that, you shall have no other gods before me. It's a statement about, again, who God is and the responsibility that people have to put him not just above all gods, but to dethrone any other god in their heart, any other image, or as we go on to see in verse 4, you shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Now, if we go on from this, let's go on to the next verse, Jonathan. We remember that this sin of idolatry, the very first command that God gave, if you want to say the first two commandments, that they all heard from the mountain, what was the very first account of sin that we see happening? The breaking of that first set of commandments. It says, now when the people saw that Moses delayed coming down from the mountain, the people gathered together to Aaron and said to him, come make us gods that shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. And Aaron said to them, break off the golden earrings which are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me. So all the people broke off the golden earrings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. I don't know if I put any more than that or not. We know what they did with this, though, right? What did they make out of it? A golden calf, right? That was the image. Now, what's very important in that text, I think, for us to understand it, is they make the golden calf, and Aaron says, behold, what? The God that brought you out of the land of Egypt. Well, there it is. Yeah. This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt, that Aaron says there in verse 4. The command, I think the second command, don't have a graven image, doesn't just mean don't make a statue of a monkey and say, oh, monkey God, I worship you. It means don't make a statue of a monkey and say this is an image of who? God, the God, right? Yahweh God, oh, he looks like a monkey. Or Yahweh God, he looks like a bull. It's not that. God, the commandment is, I am so above you. I'm above you as your God because I'm the one that's brought you out. You can't have any other gods before me. And don't even make a statue that you claim to look like me because that's not me, right? I'm not down on that level. I'm above that. You're going to be sacrificing bulls to me. You're going to be sacrificing goats and sheep and birds, and you're going to be giving yourselves, but I'm above all that. I'm infinitely above all of these things. And so again, that command is tied in. And we see, I don't have these verses up there, but if we went to Romans chapter 1, again in the New Testament, we would see that the command is no different under our understanding of things. And I should say this, I shouldn't have to constantly go back and say, the understanding is not different today. As Brother John's been teaching on Sunday morning, the morality and the nature of God does not change from New Testament and Old Testament. It's the same God. The ceremony of the laws can change, and the particulars can change, and that God can more perfectly reveal himself to us. So Jesus is a more perfect revelation of God than the offering of bulls and goats and the feast days and all of this. Jesus more fully reveals that. Not to say that God changed and there were these rules and now there's these rules, is that under Jesus we more fully understand the nature of God, and the commands that he's given us get us even closer to him than what they had under the law of Moses. But again, we would see in Romans chapter 1 that the idolatry of worshiping the created thing, worshiping animal, worshiping man itself, is what led to sin. And Paul would say it was because of a lack of gratitude in their heart, because of a lack of thankfulness, that they turned to worshiping the creature instead of the creator. And it's really amazing, but Paul says in Romans 1, what is the sin that follows idolatry every time? What is it? It's very specific. Homosexuality, which is very strange to us, but it's true. In Romans 1, Paul says, you have a lack of gratitude, that leads to idolatry. And once you start worshiping the creature, what is the creature that God made that, if we wanted to argue, is the most worthy of worship? What of all creation is the most worthy of worship? Not me, but humans, right? Humanity. You really can't worship a dog for that long and then go and look at a real dog, and feel a lot of admiration in your heart for that dog, right? Because you're going to see that dog do some pretty nasty stuff and go, I don't know if that dog's really worthy of worship. But hang around certain people long enough that are very smart or very beautiful or very talented, you might be tempted to worship a person. And as soon as we're tempted to worship people, we start really worshiping who? Ourselves. And it's interesting that I think in Paul there's a tie in Romans that once you start worshiping yourself, for some reason it's just in the nature of sinful man to go from self-worship to homosexuality. Now, you can maybe think of a reason why that is, but he says that the men gave up their natural use for the woman, men with men, women with women. And in my mind, it goes back to, again, that once God is off the table and we make our own morality, then the rules have to go with it. The norms have to go with it. We have to push the boundary and kind of come up with these novel ways of living. And so again, as we see that, we see just how important this lack of idolatry was, because it all goes back to the fact that we have to put God where he belongs. He has to be on that, again, I don't even want to say the highest pedestal. He is the pedestal. He's the entirety. He's the frame. He's the picture. He's our all. We have to have him in his place if we're going to have any success in living life the correct way. What did I have next on there, Jonathan? All right, let's keep going then. Verse 11, but my people would not heed my voice, and Israel would have none of me. So I gave them over to their own stubborn heart to walk in their own counsel. Same thing we were just talking about, right, in Romans 1. I gave them up to what they wanted. If they didn't want me, so I gave them what they wanted. I gave them their own stubborn heart to walk in their own counsels. Oh, that my people would listen to me, that Israel would walk in my ways. This is, again, where we can get a picture of how God must feel. And I'm just starting to understand this a little bit, but it's this idea of God as parent. Once you're a parent, the verses that talk about God viewing Israel as a son or humans as his children and the emotions that God has towards people, we can understand them just a little bit better as parents, of the feeling you have of wanting the love of your children, wanting your children to respect you. It's funny to me. I love it when my kids say that they love me. I love it when they give me hugs. But as a parent, what you really want them is to do what? Obey you and respect you. My kid can say he loves me all that he wants, and then if I tell him to do something and he laughs at me or turns his back and runs the other way, that hurts. I would rather, sometimes they say, I hate you, Daddy. They don't say that, thankfully. But I'd rather them say, I hate you, Daddy, sometimes than to disregard what I say as not meaning anything. Now, they're little. We're learning, right? We're trying not to spare the rod and all that good stuff so that they learn to respond how they're supposed to. But even when they're little, it still hurts. Because you pour all of this love into them and this effort into them, and you have in your mind what's best for them. That's what you're living for. That's what you're working for. And so when they disrespect you, it feels like a slap in the face. And so at least in that extent, God here says, oh, that my people would listen to me, that Israel would walk in my ways. God is in that similar sense saying, you're my people, I bought you, you're my children. Why won't you just listen to me? Why won't you just obey me? Let's go on to the next verse, Jonathan. This verse always sticks out in my mind and really makes me sad in a lot of ways. Just the image of God that we get in Hosea 11. He says, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. As they called them, so they went from them. They sacrificed to the Baals and burned incense to carved images. So again, idolatry is the context. I called them out, and then they started worshiping idols. Verse 3, I taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by their arms. That's what kills me. Because if you had kids, you know what this means, right? You did this, where you take them and you hold them by the arms and they take their first steps. God says, that's what I did with Israel. I literally held up Ephraim by the hands, and they took their first steps out of Egypt. And if you know what that's like as a parent, then your heartstrings should already be pulled, right? That's how God viewed Israel, as he was their God, and he was walking with them. But they did not know that I healed them. And I think there's also something there, right? Do our kids have any clue the amount of effort and sacrifice that we put into their well-being? They don't know. They know Daddy yelled at me when I was walking towards this direction. They don't know that I'm trying to get them not to walk out in front of a car, right? Or that when I spank them when they get too close to the road after not listening, I'm doing that so that they don't put themselves in danger. They don't understand that, but we do, right? And God says, this is what I did for Israel, what I did for Ephraim, but they did not know that I healed them. I drew them with gentle cords, with bands of love, and I was to them as those who take the yoke from their neck. I stooped and fed them. I think that's a good cross-reference to the open your mouth and I'll fill it, right? God's taking care of them. He says, this is the relationship I have. This is what I want. I love them. They're my son. And they betrayed me. And they deserted me for false gods and for those that weren't gods at all. Let's continue on, Jonathan. It always comes to my mind in that context as we read this Psalm 2, the words of Jesus. Shortly before the time when he'd be crucified, he's coming around the bend there from Bethany, and he sees the city of Jerusalem. And he says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing." Is Jesus just talking about the number of times that he as a man had come to Jerusalem during his ministry? Or is he referring to every single instance throughout the history of the Old Testament as God incarnate, that he himself held out his hand to his people that were erring? I think it's the latter. He's saying all of these times as God, I wanted to gather you in this parental relationship, but you would not do it. So see, your house is left to you desolate, for I say to you, you shall see me no more till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. It's a sad kind of thought. You know, we within the religious world, there have been for hundreds of years these arguments between the sovereignty of God and the free will of man and what can be done. And obviously, I will say that God can do whatever he wants. God can have whatever he wants. But the Bible still claims that there are times when God can hold out the arm, he can have the hand ready to lift up, and the person can say what? No, I don't want you. I don't need you. I can take care of myself. And God just shakes his head and says, what? I'm not going to drag you kicking and screaming. I'm not going to make this happen for you. If you've rejected me, I'm going to give you what you want. And that's always the part we have to remember. And it's difficult to do, especially when we see the debauchery going on in the world around us and all of the sexual sin and the things going on in our country. We have to remember when we see people in that state, they're getting what they want. As sad as that is, that's what they want. And God, in his really mercy, I guess you'd say it, but in his justice, he gives people what they want. He's not going to keep it from them. And unfortunately for them, it's leading them down the road to condemnation. All right, let's keep going, Jonathan. We're almost out of time here. Is that the last thing I had? That's it. Let's go back to the last verses of the Psalm. If you can scroll up, starting at verse, that's it, right there. Go down to verse 14, actually, if you can do that. I would soon subdue their enemies and turn my hand against their adversaries. Go on to verse 15, and we'll just read through the end. The haters of the Lord would pretend submission to him, but their fate would endure forever. He would have fed them also with the finest of wheat, and with honey from the rock I would have satisfied you. And so basically all we get at the end here as we view the psalm is God saying, you're never far from God's salvation. It's never that idea that, man, we were just totally without hope. Things got so bad, there was nothing that could be done. God's saying, if you will just turn to me, what will happen? You're going to be taken care of. Now, again, we have to understand in certain historical contexts that this doesn't mean that, hey, if Titus gets his act together and does right, God's going to spare, for instance, America. Right? If Titus can just get his act together and turn to God, then the entirety of our nation would be saved. That's not necessarily the case, but we do believe what the Bible says when it says that righteousness does what to a nation? It exalts a nation, right? But sin is a reproach to any people. So we have to ride that line of understanding between knowing that even, let's say that everybody in this room is extremely righteous, we still have to deal with the consequences of the historical movement of sin within our country and things like that. But at the same time, we can't ever get to the point where we say, well, it doesn't matter whether I'm righteous or not. Because, as we see here, God's salvation is always just around the corner. God is ready and willing to be what we need him to be if we will put him in the proper place. Thank you all for bearing with me.